Path of Exiles, that's right, we have some more spicy drama to discuss for Path of Exile Necropolis League, but it's not actually related to the Necropolis League mechanic. We're not talking grave crafting, we're not going to talk about the All Flame Embers or the devoted modifiers today. Instead, we're talking about tier 17 maps, or purple maps, the new tier of endgame that was introduced in 3.24. Now, this was supposed to be the bridge between normal mapping, pinnacle bosses, and uber bosses in Path of Exile 1. Was it actually that? Well, no. Instead, T17 maps appear to be a far harder version of the content we were able to encounter before. And it's not necessarily because the mechanics are harder in the boss fights. It's not because the packs are more difficult. It's not because the terrain mostly involves corridors that are very tight and difficult to navigate. No, it's actually because of all the modifiers that are present on these tier 17 maps. Now, in the past, we encountered something very similar to this, really just in the last few leagues, and that are the Valdo's maps, okay? Those maps had a special new tier of modifiers that we could encounter because GGG really wanted to make something special, to allow players to craft a map of their own that would not be like anything else that people could encounter in Path of Exile. They could put the Feared in a map, they could send players to the Void, essentially deleting their characters upon death, and other stuff like that. Well, in tier 17 maps, that's not happening. But Grinding Gear Games has gone full on sadistic and made a set of modifiers that absolutely annihilate many character builds out there. And at the beginning of the league, when you dropped a tier 17 map, whether it was a random drop or, you dropped it from trade, you couldn't modify it at all. When it dropped, it had a set number of modifiers, it had set modifiers, and you could not touch them. Well, they reversed that piece of logic, and now they are allowing us to modify the T17 maps with Chaos Orbs. That has made things easier, and now people are actually able to roll these maps into modifiers that don't necessarily brick certain builds. However, these modifiers are still extremely difficult, and that is where the drama emerges, everyone. And I do believe this drama might have a little bit more merit than the devoted modifier drama that we discussed last week. And that drama is that these are harder than uber bosses for many people, for many builds. And they are supposed to serve as the gateway or the bridge from normal mapping and pinnacles to ubers. However, if this content is more difficult and you need to run it a ton more to get the actual uber boss fragments, how exactly are people supposed to get to ubers in a smooth fashion? There are a lot of people who can clear ubers right now and make characters dedicated to bossing and downing ubers in that first week, those first 2 weeks, that no longer can do that because the tier 17 maps are blocking them. Now, that's just the first part of the drama. We'll get into the second part momentarily. But let's address Grinding Gear Games' philosophy here. Because if they are telling the truth, and they would like this content to be the bridge from T16s and the normal pinnacles to ubers, then obviously it's too difficult. Obviously, many of these modifiers need to be toned down, maybe some need to be removed, maybe we need to be able to run these as magic or white maps instead of only the rare maps that we currently can run them as, or Grinding Gear Games may have done a little fib, and they wanted these to be harder than uber bosses. They wanted progression to be slowed down quite a bit from the start of a league to, the first week of a league when people are downing ubers in a few days, especially people like Ben who can down them almost instantly, okay? People like me aren't going to be downing ubers very quickly. I haven't even been able to attempt tier 17 maps yet, but others can progress rather quickly. And now with these maps in play, with their wild modifiers, with their bosses that are modified by these modifiers, they are acting as a stopper to the ubers. So Grinding Gear Games has a few options here, okay? One, they can tone down the tier 17 maps. The purple maps can have lower modifier tiers. They can be rolled as white or blue, not just yellow and rare. That's a way to make them easier, right? if they want to make them easier. But if this is the difficulty bar that they would like to set, there is another option, and that is buffing the uber bosses in Path of Exile. Now, I'm of the opinion that once you learn a boss really well, and there's not a lot of other wild crap that can go on, like is possible in the T17 maps, where these end boss fights and these pack fights are wildly variable from map to map depending on the modifiers that you roll. The uber boss fights are not too different, and you run these uber boss encounters white. You don't have modifiers on them anymore. You just have the fragments that you insert in. You're not rolling invitations as you were in the past. So they're pretty set in stone. You know the modifiers that you're going to encounter. So Grinding Gear Games has an option here. They can make the uber boss fights more difficult. Now, people might hate that, and that might even spur more drama into the community, but maybe they want to elongate the progression people are having. It has been more difficult for me to progress from white to yellow to reds in this league than any prior league before. And of course, I am extremely knowledgeable. I've played the game a ton, but it has still been more difficult. Maybe that's a purposeful design decision from Grinding Gear Games. And this was a little obscured because they wanted T17 maps really to be that bridge, and it turned out they were far harder. They are just a wall, essentially. They're blocking people from getting to the Ubers, and the Ubers are still down in the same way, essentially. They're not buffed that much. So maybe Grinding Gear Games needs to buff Uber bosses. Maybe they need to add modifiers to Uber fights that wildly vary them, just like the T17 maps. Maybe the Searing Exarch needs to have the Eater of Worlds ball phase in the Uber version, right? That'd be great. Or you know, we could do diagonal balls in the Uber Exarch encounter. Or Uber Elder could have an appearance from, I don't know, let's just keep going with the ball phase, the Searing Exarch ball phase. Just put the Searing Exarch ball phase into every single fight as a possibility. I think that would just be absolutely beautiful. Now, that's the first part of the drama, essentially. The T17 maps are too difficult. There's another piece of drama here too, though, everyone. And that's that the T17 maps are too difficult and are being walls, and lots of vital items are now dropped only by the Uber versions of bosses. Now, this was supposed to be a good thing. We were supposed to split out the normal version loot tables from the Uber version loot tables, and everybody saw that as a universal W when it was announced. However, now that it's actually been in the game for quite some time, we're seeing the consequences of that. Lots of items that historically would populate trade, people would be able to find on SSF by farming the normal version over and over, are now far less available. And these are items that make builds, right? Items like Starforge, Voidforge, Ashes of the Stars, Crystallized Omniscience. So those used to be far stronger, but still, they're now locked behind the Uber versions. And that's unfortunate, because lots of people whose builds relied on those are unable to function. Or if they'd like them to function, you have to pay a pretty penny for the items that you would like. So this also plays into my theory that Grinding Gear Games is trying to elongate the progression path, because if a lot of these key items are locked behind the Uber bosses now, and we have to farm the Ubers more, and we need to get characters powerful enough to do so, that's gonna take longer for people to max out their characters. However, then we have the issue that a lot of build power relied on these items before, and now they need to down the Ubers without those items, and they need to down the T17 maps, which are harder than the Ubers. So you see the dilemma a lot of people are having right now. The drama is more palatable than the necropolis grave crafting, in my opinion. And even though I haven't ran any T17 maps, you know, I've written about them in my little journal. I've ran lots of T16s, I've done pinnacles. I still have a pretty firm opinion on this, and I do think Grinding Gear Games should tone down the power of the T17 maps, the difficulty of them. We'll see if they do any other post-league launch patches like they have by making the maps modifiable like they did in the last patch. I think that there's something incoming. There's been enough hubbub, and I do think it's credible. So Grinding Gear Games, I do think you should act on this, or you should make a statement If you want T17s to be harder than the current Ubers, say that. And if you want the current Ubers to be harder than T17s, then you need to make some changes to them. And that's just going to up the progression path for a lot of PoE players, which for some is a good thing. And for others, the Zoomers, whew, it's going to be a spicy Necropolis League, everybody. Let me know, do you agree with me? Do you disagree with me? Tell me in the comments. And if you like this video, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your fellow exiles. Anyways, that's all for today. Talakura, exiles.